Good evening and welcome. Noswaith dda croeso. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm TJ Rawlinson, Director of Development and Alumni Relations here at Cardiff University. And you are here this evening as part of the Cardiff community, including alumni, staff, donors, friends who are supporting the university. Now, as you've seen, tonight's event will be recorded and you'll receive the link afterwards, which you're very welcome to share. This evening, we're showcasing one of Cardiff's leading research and innovation teams. In today's digital landscape, we're more connected than ever before. Information flows at lightning speed across social media platforms, news outlets, personal networks. And alongside this access to information comes a growing threat: disinformation. Now, this refers to the deliberate spread of false or misleading information. And this has emerged as one of the most pressing challenges of our time. We've seen it in the UK this summer, how disinformation can incite people to behave violently, how democratic elections taking place across the globe this year may be impacted, and with online communications being a tool to influence people's thinking and decisions on how they vote. Right now, the need to identify and call out disinformation and who the authors are is crucial. So I'm delighted that we are showcasing this evening the work being done at Cardiff University to tackle this important issue. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Professor Martin Innes, who is the director, and Sam Williams, PhD student, are both based at the university's Security, Crime, Intelligence, Innovation Institute. And they'll be sharing their work and its impact with us. As ever, they'll answer your live questions this evening. You are welcome to enter questions in the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. We'll answer as many as time permits, but for now, I'm delighted to ask Martin, followed by Sam, to present. Welcome and praise.
Thank you, TJ, and good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for this talk. So, when I try to explain to students or members of the public who are coming to a talk about how and why disinformation works and why it's important, I often start off by talking about the parable of the zombie raccoons. And the parable of the zombie raccoons goes something like this. In April 2018, in a small town in North America, the local newspaper ran a story talking about how the town was being overrun by a plague of zombie raccoons. And the reason that they referred to them as zombie raccoons was that the raccoons were baring their fangs, as you'll see in the kind of slide picture there, but they were also rearing up on their hind legs and kind of staggering around. And if you're a bit of a raccoon fan like I am, you'll know this is not how raccoons usually behave. But for our purposes, what's fascinating about this story is that within 48 hours, this small local story had gone viral around the world and had been picked up by almost every global media outlet talking about this plague of zombie raccoons in this town in North America. And this happened even though we know, and it was known at the time, that this was not true. They were not really zombie raccoons. Scientists had some time before worked out that these sort of behavioral anomalies, the rearing of up on the hind legs and the burying of the fangs, these behavioral anomalies were a symptom of the raccoons being infected by distemper. But the point is, even though we knew what was really causing that, it didn't matter in terms of whether this story went viral or not. What mattered was that it was surprising, entertaining, and it captured people's attention. And this is exactly the same set of ingredients that are critical in making disinformation campaigns work. if you can't capture people's attention, then you can't influence their thoughts, their feelings, or their actions. And that is what disinformation campaigns and information operations try to do. They try to capture your attention, and then they use that to try and manipulate and exploit the ways in which you interpret the world around you. So, as TJ said in a kind introduction, at Cardiff we've been interested in this area for about a decade now. And particularly the extent to which disinformation is a major global challenge impacting our security, prosperity, and democracy more fundamentally. Um, and we're interested in it both as a problem in its own right. So how do we explain why disinformation happens and what its kind of dynamics and mechanics are? But we're also interested in the ways it has shaping effects across a number of multiple public policy problems, such as health, climate, and national security. And the central issue for us is how can this kind of disordered information be used to influence public perceptions and political decision making, and the ways in which this is done. And in doing so, we're trying to put the problem in a historical and global context, because it's quite important to understand that the kinds of issues that we're seeing today and the amount of attention that's being directed to it should not mislead us into thinking it's a new problem. The first reference that we've been able to find to misinformation and disinformation actually comes from 1601, and it was made in the context of the English Civil War. But in the 1930s, George Orwell was also writing about it, and a number of people over the decades since then have been writing about it. But what is important about the moment that we're in currently is the particular technologies associated with our information environment. The particular state of our media ecosystem has altered the speed and scale at which deliberately misleading information can travel. So for the past decade, we've built up a major multi-year, multi-million-pound international research program. And it has both an applied strand where we're working with governments, UK government, the EU, and others to try and understand what's going on at the moment and what we can do about it. But we also have an academic research strand where we're trying to do sort of more fundamental science in terms of understanding both information operations, where they're delivered by foreign states, and disinformation campaigns that might be coming out from groups of citizens on a more domestic kind of basis. So in order to illustrate this, I thought I'd just give you three brief examples, three little snippets from some of the work that we've been doing over the past decade to illustrate different dimensions of this problem. So the first example I want to talk about relates to the US election in 2020. And about 7 days before the US presidential election in 2020, my research team identified a network of Twitter accounts that were acting in a coordinated manner. And we were able to kind of link these accounts to an information operation that was operating out of China. And the important point about this network of accounts was that it was promoting some videos and some footage of ballot burning. And one of these videos that they were pushing around, that they were responsible for pushing around, got picked up by a very significant figure in the US. And immediately, this video got 1.2 million views. But what we were able to do was send the details of these accounts to Twitter, who suspended over 400 of them in the immediate lead up to the election, hopefully having some kind of disruptive effect upon what they were doing. And then just as a sort of a side point, we also identified that some of this same network that wasn't taken down happened to be engaged in amplifying the discord around the events that happened on January the 6th in the United States in the Capitol building there. So that's my first kind of example. My second example relates to perhaps the most well-known Russian information operation, which was the Internet Research Agency. And in many ways, the Internet Research Agency kicked off a lot of the contemporary interest in information operations and foreign state uses of disinformation, because they were the group and the organization that were found attempting to interfere in the 2016 US presidential election, which really put this sort of this kind of issue on the map. But what we were able to do, or what we happened to do, is we identified that not only were these group of accounts operating out of St. Petersburg in Russia, interfering in the US presidential election, they also interfered in the aftermath of the 4 terrorist attacks that happened in the UK in 2017. And I'm sure many people on the call will recognise or remember this image of a woman walking past one of the victims lying on the ground. And this was used to create a far right narrative suggesting that people of the Muslim faith didn't care about the terrorist attacks. This was significantly propagated and amplified by operators sitting in St. Petersburg, working for the Internet Research Agency, trying to destabilize life in the UK, trying to sow discord, and trying to kind of create distrust in our public institutions. And that provides a link to the third piece of work that I was going to just talk briefly about, which happened earlier this year in March 2024. So in the early part of this year, there were lots of conspiracy theories and rumors going around on the internet and on social media about the health and whereabouts of the Princess of Wales. This was before it was widely known that she was being treated for cancer. So there were lots of kind of rumors going on. What we were able to identify was a different Russian information operation called Doppelganger, that is well known in the open source research community, was deliberately taking these conspiracies and amplifying them and boosting them and propagating them. They were trying to undermine trust in our institutions. They were using the stories about the Princess of Wales. They were hijacking them, and they were trying to propagate anti-Ukrainian narratives as a way of hitting their key performance indicators. So the Internet Research Agency was one type of organization. The people responsible for Doppelganger are a commercial organization who are being contracted to deliver disinformation operations on behalf of a foreign state. And this work that we did got a lot of attention. It resulted in over 352 unique stories in the international media, and I've listed some of the outlets that picked it up. And the university's media team estimated that our work had an audience engagement of around 7 billion. So that's just kind of illustrating some of the work that we're doing, but obviously it all needs to be contextualized, and it needs to be put in place in terms of the contemporary moment. And within that, there are a number of evolving challenges for the research agenda associated with the fact that we are in what I've taken to calling over the past year an everything, everywhere, all at once moment, in terms of we have a land war in Europe, we have the tragedy unfolding in Gaza and in Lebanon. We have regular public order protests on the streets of most Western cities. We have a slew of terror attacks. We have sabotage incidents taking place across Europe, industrial sabotage. We have upticks in hate crime. And all of this is making the information environment more confused, more difficult to navigate and to understand. And for us, trying to do that understanding and trying to help with that understanding, that produces 4 key challenges. The first challenge is really what I refer to as an attribution challenge. So it's getting harder and harder to work out who is responsible. But there is equally a data challenge for us in that lots of the social media companies who have data that allow us to research and understand these kind of issues are restricting independent researchers' access to these data. We really don't have a very good understanding of what impact are these kind of information operations and disinformation campaigns having. We can sometimes think about tactical impact. So what did a specific operation achieve, or what did a specific disinformation campaign do? But we don't have a very good strategic picture in terms of what the cumulative overarching impacts of these are. And then finally, we have a control challenge, perhaps one of the most important issues, which is what can we do about any of this? And it's at this point I'd like to hand over to Sam, who's one of my PhD students, because this is the subject of his PhD.
Yeah, so thanks, Martin, and thanks, TJ, and thank you for everyone for joining in. I'm Sam Williams. I'm a PhD student at Cardiff University. So following on from Martin's presentation, I'll give you a slightly different perspective of the work ongoing in the Institute by approaching it from a student's perspective, and namely by explaining my PhD titled How are Social Control Measures Responding to Foreign State Influence Operations Constructed and Delivered? I'm therefore focusing on the responses to the operations rather than solely the operations themselves. And given Martin's presentation, I won't delve into explaining the concept of influence operations too much, but I will provide a couple of points that are relevant to my study. So firstly, influence operations are a fiercely contested term, with there being a lack of clarity with regard to what constitutes them. I'm solely looking at foreign state influence operations, which, given the breadth and variety of these, my study broadly considers as operations aiming to foster a culture of conflict and mistrust in their adversaries, namely, from my perspective, the West. This often includes, but is not limited to, disinformation. These operations adapt and escalate in response to real-life events, whether this be alongside wars, elections, or new technological advances, such as the deployment of social media platforms. Despite this, they do not merely disappear absent of these events. They are long-term strategic outputs with long-term strategic goals, evidenced by the fact that these operations have been documented since the 1920s, with Martin explaining that disinformation has existed even earlier than this. In recent times, however, the turning point in terms of the awareness of the problem has been the Russian Internet Research Agency's number of elections, specifically the US election in 2016. So whilst my PhD evidently does concern influence operations, it's actually a PhD of social control, which, to grossly oversimplify, refers to the ways in which society responds to problematic behaviour. I'm particularly interested in how the boundaries between formal control, state-led, and informal social control, non-state-led, are blurring and causing control to become more commonplace throughout society. So a quick note before we move on. I consistently mention control actors, which refers to the different organisations that are tasked with implementing control. For example, a platform actor would be Meta, X, or TikTok, for example. A government actor, in my case, is the UK, EU, US, and then a civil society actor might be an academic organisation, journalist, or a fact-checking organisation. So moving on to methodology in this next slide, my data collection was conducted in 3 phases. First of these was a qualitative documentary analysis, which, for those unfamiliar, consisted of retrieving publicly available documents produced by online platforms, governments, and civil society actors that discussed influence operations. I documented firstly how these various actors define the problem of influence operations, and secondly, which responses each actor is, or often more importantly, is not outlining. I subsequently conducted over 20 semi-structured qualitative interviews with a mixture of employees of the same different types of control actors. The semi-structured phrase simply means that I had an interview guide of topics I'd like to cover, but the interviews were primarily directed by the interviewee's answers. The aim of these was to provide further insights into why different actors have defined the problem and responded to it in different ways, and the broader challenges they are facing attempting to do so. Phase 3 consisted of a multi-sided digital ethnography. This involved me identifying several different known online influence operations via government and platform reports, knowledge from my colleagues in the Institute, and social media accounts that were exposing such influence operations. I followed these through several social media platforms using platform algorithms and post and account interactions to identify accounts engaging in similar types of behaviors. I subsequently documented the different types of responses visible towards these operations. For example, if an account suspected of engaging in such operations was removed, this was documented. Or if government accounts exposed such operations, this was documented. This phase therefore contrasted to the first two in that it revealed what was actually happening in terms of responses, rather than what different types of actors were claiming was happening. So moving on to this next slide, I'll give what I stress in my early conclusions, given that I've just finished my data collection. First of all, there are numerous inconsistencies in terms of how different actors define and respond to the problem. This occurs across different types of actors, within the same type of actor, and even within the same actor themselves. These inconsistencies create alternative thresholds for intervention, causing responses to vary in terms of the severity and the scale at which they are implemented. However, commonalities do exist, with both governments and online platforms predominantly focusing on the behaviors influence operations exhibit, whether this be spam or the use of bots, rather than the content, i.e. the messages they actually spread. All three methods have illustrated that controlling influence operations is in danger of being basic, difficult. The variety and volume of the actors and behaviors these operations exhibit and the advantages and affordances provided by social media companies has increased the difficulty in controlling these operations. However, one positive from the perspective of controllers is that awareness of the problem and the need to control it has certainly increased, with the 2016 US election playing a large role in this. Nevertheless, my study has revealed that due to the advantages of social media and the number of actors and messages involved in operations, that a multifaceted control apparatus is required, addressing both short and long-term responses from a variety of actors. Returning back to social control, it is seen that the responses to influence operations have involved an increasing array of informal control actors. This exhibits what I described earlier in the blurring of the boundaries between informal and formal control, exemplified by the legislation enacted by governments imposing duties on online platforms to control the problem. Recent events, however, such as the Brazilian sanctions on Elon Musk, the owner of X, the French government's arrest of Telegram leader Pavel Durov, and the US Department of Justice sanctions on Russian entities, suggest that governments may be trying to reassert their position of dominance in the implementation of the control of influence operations. Now, if there's anything we don't get to in the remainder of this section, on the final slide, you will see the Institute's email. Thanks for listening.
Wow. Well, that was just thank you. Diolch, Sam, diolch, Martin. That's been a fascinating introduction. I think we'll move to the discussion for this evening, taking questions from the audience. We have some pre-submitted questions. I've seen a few coming in, so I'll start with a couple of the pre-submitted questions and go from there. I think this builds on where your PhD goes, Sam. To what extent is electoral interference overstated for political purposes?
Well, I think this feeds into, speaking about the question more broadly, I think this speaks into a broader problem with the responses, in that, whereas of course we want to control the problem of influence operations, we don't actually want to make the problem worse. So this can exhibit itself in a number of ways, whereas we don't want to maybe over amplify the impact of certain accounts by alerting people to their existence. We also don't want to maybe over exaggerate the potential impact of these operations and spread discourse of fear. And then maybe in terms of deliberate attempts to over amplify the impact of influence operations. I think in my interview phase, for example, a number of interviewees stated the weaponization of certain terms, whereas anyone that disagrees with you may be weaponizing freedom of speech if they're restricted, for example. So I think there's two sides to this. There's people maybe deliberately over amplifying their impact, but there's also the danger of irresponsible reporting, also amplifying the impact of influence operations.
So that is a natural segue to another pre-submitted question. And Sam, I'm interested in your views, and then Martin, I'd love for you to chime in. As people who digest social media and information, what can and should we be doing about misinformation so that we're not giving oxygen, as you said? What are the positive things we can and should do about misinformation?
So slightly what I referred to with responsible reporting and responsible amplification. Of course, it's not expected that people scrolling social media are always in the same mindset I might be when I'm conducting my research, but it's about maybe reading sources and understanding what the source of certain information is, and maybe understanding whether it might be reliable or not. And then this feeds into the wider point about what can governments perhaps do to help the problem. That is perhaps increasing the digital literacy of the public more generally, whether this be through education programs or prompts on social media, etc. So it's not just a problem for us on social media. We can also be drawn towards more responsible reporting and sharing.
Martin, did you want to add anything to that?
Thank you, TJ. Yeah, I mean, one of the things, sort of repeated findings that comes out of our research program is the extent to which misinformation and disinformation prospers and grows in a moment of crisis. So it's being aware of the extent to which, when debate online or in social media gets particularly hot and heated and stuff, those are the kind of moments where this stuff can really travel. So I think it's at that point in time where it's really good to just kind of think about who might want to persuade me of something. Might someone want me to believe a particular perspective? And just to try and give yourself a degree of distance before you kind of post something off or repeat something or repost something. Sometimes just a little bit of distance and a little bit of time just helps you get a degree of perspective on what otherwise can seem like a very attention-grabbing piece of content.
Well, there's another question that has come in during your talk, asked about the role of the press in giving oxygen to misinformation. And the author put in, considering that parts of the press are commercial enterprises driven by profit, how would you answer that? What is the role of the press in this space?
So I think you can see a number of media outlets trying to take this stuff very kind of responsibly and putting in place verified fact-checking kind of procedures, and that's really, really important. One of the pieces of work that we did at the Institute that we published in 2020, I think, was a very detailed piece of analysis where we showed the extent to which Russian information operations were trying to manipulate media websites. So what they were doing is they were going in, and a lot of media websites these days have sort of comment functions where readers can kind of comment and post on stories. And what we were able to show is that they were going in and deliberately trying to engineer the commenting patterns after stories that were seen as relevant to them. And I think we ended up identifying that this was happening in 16 countries and with about 30 global media brands that it was going on. Some of them took our findings and responded and introduced better moderation of their comments functions. Others chose to ignore them precisely because they're interested in getting eyeballs and traffic on there. But very interestingly, a couple of weeks ago, the US Department of Justice issued some information about it, and were talking about both about this sort of commenting function and the ways in which those are manipulated, but also the extent to which the operatives operating out of Moscow and St. Petersburg see getting a story in Western media as a win. That's one of their key performance indicators. That's one of the things that they're looking for. And so if we want to try and do something and squash this kind of thing, it becomes really important that our press, our journalists are very alert to the degrees in which some of our adversaries are trying to infiltrate and shape our media environment.
Sam, did you want to add something there? You looked like you were.
Yeah, so I think from my perspective, a lot of my interviews especially outlined that responsible journalism is essential, etc. And as you mentioned then, a lot of these are commercial entities. And it's just in a similar vein to we want platforms to help respond to the problem, but these are also commercial entities. So I think the question from my point of view when looking at responses is, how do you force them to comply? Because their reason for existing is not necessarily to reduce the presence of influence operations or the impact of influence operations. It's as a commercial entity. So one of the difficult maybe points in the literature or the current studies is how to actually force these to comply, whether it be through recent sanctions by the DOJ, for example, or legislative provisions that have grown recently.
So there's another question that's come in, which talks about prevention being better than a cure, and that is around how can we equip a lay audience to be more mature in their digestion of things? Are there practical tools we can give them? And how do you, in addition to taking away, the financial benefits that you talked about, to making sure that journalists are well aware of this whole picture, what can we do to help lay people address this more thoughtfully?
So yeah, once again, this was a theme throughout my interviews in that I think the responses have to be almost layered, or if you think of it almost as a pyramid. And at the bottom, a lot of interviewees suggested we need to strengthen our resilience against it. So this might be media literacy programs in schools, or offering courses to people online on how to understand information, how to use social media. And then that means we're overall more resilient to such operations. Then as you slowly move up, it's about facilitating maybe cooperation between governments and platforms so that these responses are linked. And then right at the top might be your direct responses, whether this be removing accounts, etc. So a massive part of it is potentially these literacy programs and trying to increase our understanding. But it's important that it's layered with the other responses, because you're unlikely to, it's not a one size fits all approach with the variance that's included in these operations.
So there's a question that we received ahead of your talk, and I'm curious about this because I'm curious about how your institute works. It all stood out with the U.S. election coming forward next month. How do you actually go about monitoring disinformation around a democratic election?
So we have built up over the years almost like a toolkit of methodology. So there's no one thing that you can do that makes it work. And so we do sort of global media monitoring. So we're trying to track stories across the global media. We also try and respond to particular events where we think this looks like there are manipulation activities taking place around it. But then we also do more targeted investigations and research, looking at particular entities that we suspect are engaging in these, to try and understand who are they, what are they doing, how are they doing it. And then the final strand really is also trying to understand audiences and the public, and what are the vulnerabilities that might be there that could be exploited. So part of the work that we've done is we've been doing sort of large scale surveying across Europe, and you see very, very significant differences across different country level populations in terms of their use of different types of social media, the issues they care about, and the levels of trust that they have in government. And all of those kind of are ingredients that could be manipulated. So that's kind of, if you like, the kind of the technical answer. But I think the other thing that is worth talking about is having really talented researchers who can do this work and who are invested and are interested in it. And one of the things about the team that we've got in Cardiff is they've been with us a long time. They've been doing this and so you build up that kind of expertise and feel for the game. And actually having a really talented team is absolutely critical at this point in time when you're trying to deal with something like the US election, which is almost on an unprecedented scale in terms of the amount and sources of information that are out there and are kind of impacting upon the democratic process.
Really interesting. Sam, is there anything else that we should be aware of as we go into the US election, or that you'll be doing?
So in terms of what I'll be doing, I'm more focused on what responses are coming out right now, hopefully. So that's more what I'm intrigued on, and specifically, I think, what the Department of Justice did by releasing this affidavit and these sanctions on the Russian entities a few weeks ago. I think that's things like that is what I try to keep abreast of. Whereas I think, as Martin just explained, the rest of the team, or a lot of the team, will be focusing more on the operation themselves and what's coming out.
So you've spoken a lot about Russia. I guess you'd probably speak about China or other foreign influences. Does the Institute also investigate homegrown UK actors? You talked a little bit about kind of the activated activist, but are there more coordinated UK-based groups as well interested in disinformation?
Yeah, absolutely. And in many ways, that's how I got into this. So I started off my work on social media and digital analytics, more focused upon sort of extremism and counterterrorism. And we were quite interested in the ways in which different groups would, in the aftermath of a terror attack, would try and kind of put their ideological propaganda and their justifications for why they've carried out these attacks online. And I've been doing this with a team, many of whom still work with me, for a number of years. But the kind of the game changer really here in the UK was the Skripal attacks in Salisbury, and that's where we started to see the crossover. But where we're at the current time is, yes, we do talk a lot about state threats, but we are in a situation now where almost every major geopolitical event that you can think of acts as a magnet for misinformation and disinformation. And you've got different people doing it for different reasons. So broadly speaking, you will have state actors trying to kind of destabilize their adversaries. But alongside that, you will also have people who are doing it for domestic political reasons because they think they can get a political advantage, particularly in an electoral cycle. A lot of people are doing it for monetary reasons. So, as I talked about when I was talking about the zombie raccoons, getting attention, getting eyeballs on your story. If you are a social media influencer, that's a way to make money. So anything controversial works like that. And then you also have a sort of a category of person who wants to sow and get disinformation flowing because they just want to have fun or tear the house down. And we've got all of these things going on all at once at the moment. And that's what makes this both interesting but deeply challenging work.
There's a question that I'm interested in, which is around who finds your work particularly valuable, one, and then second, given how much you understand about information and its flow and its influence, there's surely an opportunity to monetize the kind of knowledge base and methodology that you've built up. But let's start by saying who really cares about your work and is growing dependent on it.
So, I mean, we work with a lot of people, and that's always a very interesting, fascinating element of what we're able to do. So we do have sort of government kind of interest, and quite understandably so. We get quite a lot of work with journalists and media organisations who are interested in understanding the ways in which they're being manipulated and what they might be able to do about it. But you also have, in different parts of the world, lots of civil society groups and lots of civil society who deeply, deeply care about the ways in which democracy in their countries is being subverted. And so we're kind of quite keen to help them as well. So it's not just us kind of producing things and then nothing happening. We're quite keen to equip people to kind of give them the tools that help them defend their traditions and democracy in their country. And I think that's quite an important part of what it is that we're able to do.
That's exciting and fascinating to hear about your audiences. So then the second part of my question was around monetization. I mean, everything that you've described is how to that you have a very sophisticated understanding of the themes that will play with broad audiences across different sectors. And you also have insight into how to get messages repeated through social networks. And those are kind of an advertiser's dream to have those tools available for them. So is there a monetization that Cardiff University can do with this, or is it important for you to stay in that space of working with governments and civil society too?
Yeah, I think there's lots of people who have done that and have kind of tried to do that. I'm not sure that's really kind of what motivates me and kind of gets me out of bed in the morning. I'm quite old-fashioned kind of, and I see a real sort of public service ethos here in terms of being able to do it and to do it well. And I think there is also something important about it being rooted in a university and grounded in a university, and the idea that what we are principally interested in is the generation of knowledge and understanding. And in a world that is so polarized, that I think has an enormous public value. And we don't always talk about that, and perhaps we should, because the idea that we will be relatively independent and try to be as objective as we can in a polarized world is something I think is really worth standing up for. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the conversations that you'll have are comfortable. It's a comfortable relationship in terms of the kind of the deal I always make with anybody I work with is, if you're doing something that's good, I'll tell you it's good. But if it's bad, the deal is I tell you it's bad. That's it. And if you can't deal with that, we're not working together. But that independence in a highly polarized world, I think, is something that the ethic of a university is really important for.
Martin, I think that's a brilliant closing statement for this, but I don't want to stop without giving Sam a chance to tell us what's next after your PhD concludes. Do you have ideas? Are you thinking that you'll follow Martin in this kind of noble mission to keep universities saving democracy and the world one step at a time?
Well, it sounds very appealing. But no, the work at the Institute I think is thoroughly enjoyable, and I think I'm lucky enough to Martin's given me opportunities to do projects outside my PhD, which I've enjoyed. So yeah, continuing in this sector, hopefully with the knowledge I built up my PhD, sounds very appealing to me.
Exciting. Well, listen, I think I unfortunately need to close this, but Martin, Sam, I'm so grateful to you. I'm sure everybody who's online is too. And we are out of time today. So Diolch, thank you so much for your presentation and discussions. I really want to thank our webinar audience for being with us. We hope you found it interesting. I think we got through most of the questions that we had, but if you think of anything else, or if you'd like to, or if you'd like clarification about anything, do follow up with us directly. We'll make sure that Martin and Sam get a chance to interact with you. You should receive an email sometime in the coming week with a link to the recording, as well as links to register for future events. We have more of these research showcase events going on. and the university's new in-person and live streamed Cardiff Conversations events are also advertised. We'll let you know in particular about one coming up on the 23rd of October, which is going to feature Martin speaking with Babita Sharma, Cardiff alumna, on the topic of fake news. And for those of you listening, if you'd like to get involved with Cardiff University as a volunteer to help our students and helping us fundraise for our research, please follow the link in the comments box on screen now from myself, from Professor Martin Innes, and from PhD student Sam Lyons. Diolch. Hwyl fawr. I'm so sorry, my Welsh pronunciation is terrible, but thank you very much and goodbye.